So, you're planning to upgrade your graphics card and you only have a $300 budget. Well, you've got two choices here. From the green team, you have the RTX 4060, and from the red team, you have the RX 6700 XT. Now, both of these cards are pretty solid, but which one is the better choice if you're into competitive gaming? We're going to test these two cards out and run them into our competitive games right here and find out which one is the best choice for you. Let's go!
For this test, we are using the Asus RTX 4060 Dual OC Edition and the RX 6700 XT reference model, and we are putting these cards in our Ryzen 5800 X3D rig. Latest drivers have been used, and a second PC with an external capture card has also been used to ensure there is no performance loss. All games featured here are using our competitive settings to reflect what you would see in a real-world scenario. Alright, let's start with the first game, Warzone, and we are in the Uzbekistan map. Now we are in plunder mode where there's a lot of player, and let's start with 1080p. Now with 1080p, our RX 6700 XT has really high average FPS but has that terrible 1%, 0.1% lows, and you can see that in here where a frame time pacing, there's those nasty spikes. Our RTX 4060 on the other hand has lower FPS but has slightly better frame time pacing, bad but still better compared to the RX 6700 XT. Now, what I think is happening here is that Warzone is utilizing a lot of our VRAM resources. Now, the default setting for VRAM allocation is at 90% when running the game. So, we tried dropping the VRAM allocation from 90% to 80% for the RX 6700 XT, and we can already see that it's much more stable on the 1% lows. Now, same characteristics for the AMD card, we're still getting those really high average FPS, but both cards are still having low 1% lows, and I think this is another Warzone problem. That's basically Warzone being Warzone again. Now, AMD, if you are watching this video, I think you need to fix this on your cards so that you'll be able to regain that smoothness where you previously had it on the previous Warzones. Let's go with 1440p with upscaling technologies on both cards. So that's FSR 2.1 for the RX 6700 XT and DLSS for the RTX 4060. You can see that we're still getting the same problem here with our RX 6700 XT. Really high average FPS, but the lows are much worse than the RTX 4060. Now look at that VRAM allocation, boys. That's maxing out the 12GB for the RX 6700 XTs. Frame times are still not smooth for both cards, but it is much worse for AMD. And do note we have tried putting on anti-lag on and off for this, and the results are more or less the same. So previously anti-lag used to work wonders for AMD on Warzone, but this time around it seems to do nothing. Now lowering the VRAM allocation while using FSR seems to have very little effect for the RX 6700 XT. So yeah, we'll just wait and see if AMD patches this up. And before we proceed, boys, if you're interested on seeing more of our in-depth hardware testings, make sure you subscribe to the channel. These competitive shooters tend to change performance very often, especially on major game patches. Okay, let's move on to the next game. Apex Legends. Same competitive settings at 1080p. Now, on heavy action scenes, we can see in here that the RX 6700 XT is showing the better hand. It is getting a much better average FPS, 1% and 0.1% lows. Frame times is pretty stable on both cards, and we did this run at least 3 times before recording to ensure that this is a consistent experience. On static scenes, the same thing is noticeable. We're getting a much better result on our RX 6700 XT. One thing to note in here, between these two cards is the power consumption. There's a 50-watt difference between the two, which makes sense since the RTX 4060 is on a newer node. Now, let's go for some mid-range shooting scenarios, and in here we are getting maximum FPS for both cards. 1% lows still favor the red team. However, the RTX 4060 is very close behind. And one thing to note here is that we are not actually maxing out our GPU utilization. So yeah, let's move on to everyone's favorite building game, Fortnite. And as always, we'll touch on all three APIs, DX12, DX11, and performance mode. Let's start with DX12. Now, AMD used to dominate DX12 in Fortnite. Now, average FPS still goes to the RX 6700 XT. However, in our benchmark, we noticed that the RTX 4060 has better 1% lows, which is probably much more important in this game. Now, although DX12 is graphically demanding, we are not maxing our cards on this specific scenario. However, the power difference still remain at 50 watts between two cards. Jumping over to DX11, the RTX 4060 begins to pull through in this API. Average FPS and 1% lows now go to our RTX 4060. Now, we're still not GPU bound here. However, GPU power seems to be lower on the RX 6700 XT this time around. But that's basically it. The performance still goes to the RTX 4060 on this specific API. And finally, we have performance mode. And first thing we notice here is that the RX 6700 XT seems to be having AMD's old problem wherein its GPU clocks is lower. Look at that, which would explain why there is a huge difference in terms of performance between these two cards. We can artificially fix this by manually clocking the minimum clocks of the RX 6700 XT to 2500 MHz. You can do that by going through the driver and performance tuning and do all this. With our minimum clocks bump, we can see that the RX 6700 XT is catching up and is really close to the RTX 4060's performance. I thought this issue would have been fixed by now, but unfortunately that's not the case for RDNA 2 card. So if you're an AMD user, please submit a bug report to get this fixed, and feel free to link this video as your reference for the ticket. Moving on to our next competitive game, we have Valorant. And yes, I'm aware some people may say that this game can run on a potato, but we're actually here to win. So you'd want to pick the right card if you want to be on the winning team. In here, it's quite close. Average FPS goes to the RX 6700 XT, while the 1% lows goes towards the RTX 4060. Although at these high FPS numbers, you probably wouldn't notice the difference between these two cards. I'd say they're quite high enough that you wouldn't really feel it. On heavy action scenes, however, there is a significant difference between the 0.1% lows in favor for the RTX 4060. So that's something for you to note. And in terms of power consumption, we're still consuming more on our RX 6700 XT if that matters to you. But overall, for both these cards, they're quite fine for Valorant. And our next game is PUBG. We are using competitive settings here, DX11 enhanced at 1080p. Let's start with some running shots. And as you can see, the RX 6700 XT is beating the RTX 4060 by a very slim margin. Now we have high GPU usage for both cards here at 1080p. Meanwhile, power consumption for both cards also have increased even though we're at 1080p. Our RX 6700 XT is a reference model, so generally it has a bit higher temperature. So if you're purchasing an aftermarket model, yeah, it'll be better. Now moving on to heavy action scenes, we can see that the FPS lead of the RX 6700 XT has been wiped by the RTX 4060. 1% and 0.1% lows are relatively close still for both cards. So there's that. And finally, we have recently added the finals in our competitive games lineup. We are on 1440p resolution here and using upscaling technologies for both cards. On our running benchmarks, the result between both cards are very close to each other. This is a DX12 game and there will be better utilization for both our GPU and CPU. Here you can see that we have maxed out our GPU and running more than 200 FPS with 1% slows, a bit higher on the AMD card. However, this is a different case when we go on heavy action scenarios. The added pressure on graphics has put a strain on the RTX 4060's narrow bus width, which clearly reflected the 1% and 0.1% lows here. That's a huge gap between these two cards, so it's pretty clear that the RX 6700 XT is the winner for the finals. There are advantages and disadvantages on both cards depending on what game you primarily play. It is worth noting that the VRAM is not much of a factor if you're a competitive gamer, however power consumption might be, and that's for you to decide. Now, if you're more of a budget gamer and want something cheaper, we actually bought a card from AliExpress which only cost us $102 and it was actually good value. So if you're interested in that, click this video right here and we'll see you over there.